Hello again, everybody. Today we're going to turn our focus to constructing our literature review for our paper in AP Research and using the language from the rubric for the academic paper to help the reader to give us a 5. All right, we want to think about the writing experience not from the writer's experience, not from what do I need to do to complete this or what do I need to do so that my teacher gives me the grade. But think about the user experience. When you flip that around, your writing makes a little bit more sense and it actually accomplishes your goal. So let's think about the user experience as an AP reader. As I go to open up a paper and it opens up for me, I know how to read college level academic writing, but I don't know anything about this topic. Or maybe I know a little bit about this topic, but I definitely don't know everything the student knows about this topic. So when I look at the structure of my literature review, I want to start in the very beginning with what is the background or the exposition, or what do I need to know about this subject that lets me know why it's valuable, why it's important, who does it affect, and how do we connect this to getting a 5? Well, let's think about the language of the rubric. When we talk about a topic of inquiry, we start off by talking about the language saying, focus is a topic of inquiry with clear and narrow parameters, which are addressed throughout the method and conclusion. Well, I'm not going to talk about the method and conclusion in this video. We're going to talk about just the topic of inquiry. How do I make choices in my introduction to narrow this down? Maybe if I want to talk about the boundaries of my research, what very specific language helps to focus my topic? If my paper is about the negative impacts of gentrification, obviously I need to talk about what gentrification is. But how do I narrow this down? Well, I talk about gentrification as it relates to a specific community, maybe Chinatown in Vancouver, British Columbia. Now I know what the boundaries of this are. I mentioned negative impacts. Maybe I need to provide some language as to what those negative impacts are. Is it a reduction in a particular population that is residing there, or changing demographics? Is it about looking at socioeconomic status and who's being allowed to move in and who's being pushed out? Is it about rising rents? There in that introduction, I need to make it very clear to the reader, what is it that we're about to learn? I need to give that basic introduction. What is the vocabulary or the labels they need to know so that they can understand what my paper is about? Once I've established that early introduction, that background information about why this is valuable, those statistics as to who is impacted, or that very specific vocabulary, then I can move on to the next task of my literature review, which is, according to the rubric, is it explicitly connects a topic of inquiry to relevant scholarly works of varying perspectives and logically explains how the topic of inquiry addresses a gap. Okay, that means that I now need to communicate about the conversation that's happening in my body of knowledge, or my BOK. What is happening with these experts? How do they relate to each other? How have they built on each other's ideas? Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? Where do they take previously existing ideas and move them forward in the field? So how do I help the reader with understanding that? Well, one approach is I just write about all of those connections in kind of a free form, here's everything I know kind of way, without any signposts, without any subheadings. Technically, I'm accomplishing the goal, but I'm making it more difficult for the reader. What if instead I come up with subheadings and think about how would I sort these groups together? What do they have to do with each other? Going back to my example about gentrification, perhaps if I had experts or resources from relevant scholarly works that talk about particular aspects of gentrification. If I just use the subheading negative impacts of gentrification, well, the reader now knows all the sources that are in that next section are going to be related to the negative impacts of gentrification. Maybe I want to talk about the history of gentrification. So if I use the subheading history of gentrification, I know that those sources are going to explain to me what this evolution of this particular topic has been. What if I have a bunch of researchers who are looking at the relationship between rising real estate values and gentrification? That subheading would let me know that all of the experts in this section are related to rising real estate values and gentrification. Subheadings are important. They're signposts, they're signifiers. They help the reader understand relationships. When we see subheadings in a paper, it lets us know, okay, we're changing the channel or we're moving on to the next chapter. It's like when you're reading a book and one particular element of the plot has stopped and now it's time to move to a next idea. The author gives you a chapter break, right? You're now going from chapter 6 to chapter 7. You know, okay, mentally, I'm moving from one space to the next. In academic writing, those subheadings help the reader to understand we're moving from one idea to the next idea. It also helps you as a writer to put all of these things together in a logical manner. So please, whenever possible, put those big signs in there. Make it clear. Now in your rough draft, start with some very rough language for what those subheadings might be. On further revision, you might come up with better, cleaner, prettier language for what those subheadings are, but let's make them exist first. And so in the most basic sense, what do these sources have in common with each other? And let's put them down on paper so that it's organized and it assists the reader, because those subheadings help them understand the organization. All right, so now I'm talking about this field of inquiry, what they've been talking about and how it contributes to my understanding of it. Now it's important that I'm going to conclude my literature review with discussion about the gaps those researchers explored themselves, the spaces they left open, and then how that leads directly to the gap I'm addressing with my research. So if we think back to the inquiry proposal form, and you look at item number 3 on the inquiry proposal form, where you ask to explain the relationship between the work of previous researchers and the gap that you are exploring, you've probably already written this language at least in a rough form. How did those researchers explore their own gaps? What did they leave open, and how does that relate to the work you are doing? And once again, big giant sign. Let's use the word gap in our subheadings. Let's talk about defending or justifying the gap that you are going to look for. Once again, that assists the reader. They let them know that is the focus of this section of the paper. So now they're fully paying attention to how you have logically explained that gap. And if I look at that language in the rubric, once again, explicitly connects a topic of inquiry to relevant scholarly works of varying perspectives and logically explains how the topic of inquiry addresses a gap. If I'm using those subheadings and I'm grouping these gaps and making a clear written connection between the gaps of other researchers and the gap I am addressing, and it is logical, the reader is already thinking about a 5. They're already thinking they want to give me a 5. Now, in other elements of the paper, I need to keep them there, but if my literature review gives them the important background information, explains what researchers in that field have been looking at, and then looks at their gaps and my gap and the relationship between those two, by the time my reader is about to read my methods section, because that's what comes next, they're already looking to give me a 5, because the rubric says once we have logically explained how the topic of inquiry addresses a gap, that's where we're living. So help the reader give you the score that you want. Hope this was helpful.